They didn't just break out of a maximum security jail. They left a Yelp review. Too easy LOL. That was the message scrawled above the hole in the wall, where 10 inmates vanished into the New Orleans night. Welcome to Verified Crime Files. Thanks for the support. Stay tuned for daily true crime updates. And when you're done watching, hit subscribe, tap the notification bell, and share. Thank you. The air inside the Orleans Parish Justice Center didn't smell like punishment. It smelled like stagnation. It was a thick, humid cocktail of industrial bleach, unwashed bodies, and the distinct, metallic tang of rust that seemed to bleed from the very walls of the facility. For the inmates of Zone C, the decay wasn't just a living condition. It was an opportunity. By May of 2025, the jail, a sprawling concrete box notoriously plagued by federal consent decrees and staffing shortages, was practically begging to be breached. The locks on the cell doors were temperamental, clicking open with a hard shove rather than a key. The cameras blinked with the lazy irregularity of a failing grid, and the morale of the guards was lower than the waterline of the Mississippi River churning just miles away. Derrick Groves sat on the edge of his bunk, his eyes tracing the hairline fractures in the cinderblock wall. At 28, Groves was a man who understood the geometry of confinement better than the architects who built the place. He was facing a double life sentence for a 2018 Mardi Gras shooting, 2 bodies, 2 ghosts that ensured he would never breathe free air again. Unless he took it, he wasn't looking at the wall as a barrier anymore. He was looking at it as a facade. The plan wasn't his alone. It was a collective hive-mind effort of 10 desperate men. But Groves brought the cold, predatory focus of a man with zero equity left in the system. They knew the weakness wasn't the steel bars. It was the plumbing. The infrastructure behind the stainless steel toilet sink combo was rotting, the mortar turning to dust in the Louisiana damp. The key to the night of May 16th wasn't a file and a cake or a bribe guard. It was a maintenance request. Earlier that week, a work order had gone in, leaking pipe. It was a Trojan horse. A maintenance worker, whether incompetent, coerced, or complicit, had shut off the water supply to the target cell. The silence of the pipes was the signal. Without the water pressure, the heavy steel fixture was just dead weight bolted to crumbling concrete. As the clock ticked past midnight and the skeleton crew of deputies settled into the lethargy of the graveyard shift, the Justice Center became a tomb of hushed whispers. Groves looked at the others. There was no fear in their eyes, only the electric, frantic energy of animals sensing an open gate. They weren't just going to escape. They were going to insult the very cage that held them. The water was off. The guards were gone. The rout was complete. The mechanics of the breach were brutal, primitive, and terrifyingly effective, relying less on cinematic genius and more on the sheer kinetic desperation of 10 men who refused to die in a cage. At 12:23 a.m., the silence of the cell block was a heavy blanket, broken only by the rhythmic snoring of the uninvolved and the distant, metallic clank of the facility's settling infrastructure. Inside the target cell, the work began with the coordinated precision of a demolition crew operating in a library. The stainless steel combination unit, toilet and sink fused into one cold, unyielding monument of incarceration, was the only thing standing between them and the service chase behind the wall. Because the water had been killed earlier by the compromised maintenance protocol, they didn't have to worry about the explosive hiss of a ruptured pipe or the telltale flood that would have alerted the guards on the floor below. They worked the bolts, grinding metal against metal with improvised tools fashioned from the debris of their confinement, sweating profusely in the stifling, unventilated air. When the heavy fixture finally gave way, pulling free from the wall with a groan of rusted brackets, it revealed a jagged, rectangular mouth of darkness. It wasn't a clean cut. It was a wound in the building's architecture, a void of reinforced concrete and rebar that smelled of 20 years of trapped dust, sewage gases, and neglect. One by one, they forced their bodies into the hole. It was a claustrophobic nightmare, a narrow birth canal of concrete that scraped skin raw and tore at their orange jumpsuits. The space behind the wall was a labyrinth of pipes and conduit, a pipe chase designed for maintenance access, not human transit, But for men facing effectively life in prison, the squeeze of the walls felt like the first embrace of freedom. They shimmied up the vertical shafts, boots scrambling for purchase on slick piping, breathing in the stale air of the jail skeleton, moving upward and outward toward the roof access and the loading dock, driven by an adrenaline that masked the pain of cuts and bruises. Before the last man vanished into the wall, a final act of defiance was committed, a gesture that would transform this escape from a local news blip into a viral sensation of institutional humiliation. In the dim light of the cell, amidst the debris of the dismantled plumbing and the dust of the breach, one of the escapees took a marker to the painted cinder block. Above the gaping hole where the toilet once stood, they scrawled a message that was as brief as it was devastating. To Easy LL, complete with a jagged arrow pointing down into the void. It wasn't just graffiti. It was a psychological tombstone for the credibility of the Orleans Parish Justice Center. It captured the utter contempt the inmates held for the security measures designed to contain them. The LOL, laughing out loud, punctuated the crime with a modern, nihilistic irony, signaling that they weren't just escaping. They were entertained by the incompetence of their captors. This image would later splash across every screen in America, a meme of failure for the sheriff's office. But in that moment, in the dark of the early morning, it was a secret joke shared among ghosts. They moved through the guts of the building, navigating the labyrinth until they breached the exterior loading dock. The heavy steel doors, intended to keep supplies coming in, became their exit wound. As they spilled out into the humid New Orleans night, the thick air hit them like a physical wave, heavy with the scent of jasmine, exhaust, and the Mississippi River. They were out of the box, but they were still inside the perimeter, standing in the shadow of the fortress they had just humiliated, with the clock ticking down toward the inevitable dawn discovery. The transition from the sterile, regulated confinement of the Justice Center to the chaotic sprawl of the outside world was a sensory shock to the system, a jarring shift from grayscale to high-definition neon. Having breached the building, the 10 men now faced the physical perimeter, the razor wire and the fences that demarcated the line between state property and the free world. It was approximately 1 a.m., the witching hour of the city, where the darkness provided a cloak but also heightened the stakes of every movement. They scaled the fences with a frantic energy, the barbs tearing at their uniforms and skin, leaving shreds of orange fabric fluttering in the breeze like flags of their departure. Once over the wire, they were thrust immediately into the urban jungle of the Tulane Avenue corridor and the looming concrete overpass of Interstate 10. This area of New Orleans is a harsh juxtaposition of crumbling infrastructure and vital arteries of transit. The interstate hums with the relentless noise of 18-wheelers and late-night travelers, indifferent to the drama unfolding in the shadows below. The group, a huddled mass of orange, knew they were walking targets. The bright jumpsuits, designed for visibility within the prison walls, were now neon signs screaming for attention in the dark streets. They began to strip, discarding the state-issued clothing in alleyways, behind dumpsters, and in the tall grass of the interstate embankments. Some wore T-shirts and boxers underneath. Others were nearly naked, prioritizing camouflage over dignity. They were no longer inmates. They were shadows moving against the backdrop of the city lights, their hearts hammering against their ribs in time with the passing traffic. Survival instinct dictates that a pack is easier to spot than a lone wolf, and it was here, in the shadow of the I-10 overpass, that the group fractured. The dynamics of the jail block, the hierarchy, the alliances, the collective bravado, dissolved instantly upon contact with the reality of the manhunt. Derrick Groves, a predator by nature and conviction, understood this calculus better than anyone. While some of the younger or less experienced escapees stuck together, driven by a misplaced sense of safety in numbers, Groves knew that staying with the group was a death sentence. A group of men moving through the night attracts eyes. A single man is just another piece of the city's drift. Groves peeled away from the others, his movements calculated and cold. He wasn't running in a panic. He was hunting for his next move. He watched as the others scrambled toward the darker neighborhoods or tried to flag down rides, their desperation making them sloppy. Groves, carrying the weight of a double murder conviction and the knowledge that capture meant never seeing the sky again, moved with a different kind of intensity. He merged into the city's nervous system, using the noise and the apathy of the urban environment as a shield. He headed away from the obvious routes, deeper into the residential grids where he could disappear, leaving the dead weight of the other 9 to absorb the initial shockwave of the law enforcement response that was inevitably coming. He was already ghosting the system, turning himself into a phantom while his co-escapees were still acting like fugitives. The sun rose over New Orleans on the morning of May 16th with a humid, oppressive glare, illuminating a crime scene that had gone undetected for nearly 7 hours. Inside the Orleans Parish Justice Center, the routine of the morning shift change proceeded with a banal, drowsy normalcy that would soon seem criminally negligent in hindsight. It wasn't until the head count, the foundational ritual of incarceration, that the reality of the situation shattered the morning calm. Deputies moving down the tier in Zone C reached the cell and found it silent. Too silent. When the door was cracked and the interior inspected, the sheer scale of the violation left the guards stunned into silence. The cell wasn't just empty. It had been surgically altered. The absence of the toilet fixture was a jarring visual discrepancy, a hole in the reality of the room. And then, the eyes of the staff were drawn to the scrawl on the wall. "To easy, LOL." The message hit the administration with the force of a physical blow. It was a taunt that stripped away any potential spin or damage control. They hadn't just been beaten, they had been mocked. Panic cascaded through the chain of command. Radios crackled with frantic codes. The facility went into a hard lockdown, and the realization set in that 10 dangerous men, including murderers and carjackers, had been loose in the city while the jail slept. The timeline was reconstructed with horror. The escape had happened just after midnight, giving the fugitives a 7-hour head start. In the world of manhunts, 7 hours is a lifetime. It is the difference between a perimeter search and a multi-state dragnet. By mid-morning, the internal disaster had spilled out into the public sphere, igniting a firestorm of media scrutiny and political finger-pointing. The photo of the graffiti was leaked, likely by a frustrated staff member or a savvy insider, and it went viral instantly. "To easy LOL" trended on social media platforms, becoming a meme that symbolized the collapse of law and order in the city. News helicopters circled the jail, their cameras zooming in on the loading docks and the barbed wire, broadcasting the failure to the world. The sheriff held a press conference that was a masterclass in uncomfortable defensive posturing, trying to explain how a toilet could be removed and 10 men could vanish without a single alarm triggering. The public reaction was a mix of fear and dark humor. Residents of Mid-City and Treem locked their doors and checked their windows, eyeing every stranger with suspicion. The narrative quickly shifted from the incompetence of the jail to the danger of the men on the loose. Lists of names and mugshots were blasted across television screens and smartphone alerts. Derrick Groves. Murder. Armed and dangerous. The city was on edge, realizing that the T-Easy crew wasn't just a funny headline. They were desperate men who had already proven they had nothing to lose. The embarrassment of the authorities fueled a rage in the response. This wasn't just about public safety anymore. It was about erasing the humiliation scrawled on that cinder block wall. They needed catches, and they needed them fast. The response was overwhelming, a militarized flooding of the zone that turned parts of New Orleans into an occupied territory. The U.S. Marshals Service, the Louisiana State Police, and the New Orleans Police Department formed a unified task force, driven by the stinging embarrassment of the escape. Within the first 48 hours, the strategy was brute force and saturation. 9 units with bloodhounds tracked scents from the interstate embankments into the neighborhoods of Treem and the 7th Ward. Helicopters equipped with thermal imaging cameras swept the rooftops and the marshy fringes of the city, looking for the heat signatures of men hiding in the dark. The low-hanging fruit, the escapees who had panicked, lacked resources, or stayed together, were the first to fall. They were plucked from the environment with almost anticlimactic ease. Two were found huddled under a house just blocks from the jail, paralyzed by indecision. Another was caught trying to blend in at a convenience store, still wearing muddy boxers and a stolen t-shirt, his face plastered on the news playing on the TV above the cashier's head. The arrests were aggressive and swift, the officers fueled by adrenaline and the need to score wins on the board. Each capture was paraded as a victory, a step toward restoring order. The sheriff's office issued updates with almost breathless rapidity. Inmate number 1 captured. Inmate number 2 captured. The net was tightening, and for the amateur criminals among the 10, the city had become a cage smaller and tighter than the one they had left. However, as the hours turned into days and the initial flurry of arrests subsided, a chilling realization began to settle over the task force. The dangerous ones were still out there. The dragnet had caught the disorganized and the desperate, but it had missed the calculated. Derrick Groves was conspicuously absent from the intake logs. While others were tackled in backyards or surrendered out of exhaustion, Groves had vanished into the ether. The investigators began to profile him differently than the rest. They looked at his file, the cold-blooded nature of the 2018 double murder, the intelligence he displayed in his legal maneuvers, the silence he maintained during interrogations. They realized they weren't chasing a panic-stricken inmate. They were chasing a man who had been preparing for this war for years. The "too-easy" graffiti began to feel less like a group prank and more like Groves' personal signature. As the search radius expanded from the city limits to the surrounding parishes and eventually the state lines, the atmosphere in the command center shifted from frantic energy to a grim, slow-burn determination. The easy catches were done. Now, the real hunt began. The marshals dusted off their federal warrants and began the deep, tedious work of digital forensics and human intelligence. Knowing that Groves wasn't hiding under a porch, he was embedded somewhere, watching them, waiting for them to blink. The dragnet had caught the minnows, but the shark was swimming into deep water. To understand why Derrick Groves didn't panic in the chaos of the breakout, one has to dissect the cold, jagged history that forged him long before he ever stepped foot in the Orleans Parish Justice Center. Groves was not merely a participant in the escape. He was its center of gravity, a man whose criminal resume suggested a terrifying capacity for compartmentalization and violence. His conviction stemmed from a brutal double homicide in 2018, a crime that rocked the city during the height of Mardi Gras celebrations. The victims, Jamar Robinson and Byron Jackson, were not just casualties of random violence. They were executed with a precision that signaled a deep, personal vendetta. Prosecutors at his trial painted a portrait of Groves as a man who made conscious decisions to kill, a phrase that would later be echoed by the judge who sentenced him. Facing 2 life sentences plus an additional century behind bars, Groves had been stripped of all hope for legal redemption. He was a man with a nothing-to-lose ledger that was entirely full. But beyond his own crimes, Groves carried the generational trauma of a name synonymous with New Orleans' darkest police corruption. The shadow of the Kim Groves case, a 1994 hit ordered by a corrupt NOPD officer on a citizen who filed a brutality complaint, loomed over his family history, instilling a bone-deep distrust of the badge. This wasn't just about avoiding jail. For Groves, the justice system was an illegitimate predator, a machine designed to grind his lineage into dust. This psychological armoring meant that while the other escapees were running from the police, Groves was at war with them. He didn't view the escape as a frantic dash. He viewed it as a tactical repositioning in a lifelong siege. The psychological profile developed by the task force in the wake of the escape revealed a disturbing level of adaptability. Most criminals are impulsive, driven by short-term gratification and easily rattled by stress. Groves was different. He was an architect of chaos, capable of manipulating those around him to serve his ends. In the jail, he had observed the rhythms of the guards, the weaknesses of the infrastructure, and the emotional pliability of his fellow inmates. He knew who to use for muscle, who to use for distraction, and who to discard when the moment of truth arrived. The 2018 murders showcased this same chilling detachment. the ability to act with lethal intent while the rest of the city was drunk on parades and beads. As the manhunt intensified, investigators began to realize that Groves wasn't just hiding. He was likely leveraging a network of fear and loyalty that went deeper than casual street acquaintances. He wasn't the type to call his mother or hide at a girlfriend's house where the police would look first. He was the type to go where he was least expected, to exploit the cracks in society, just as he had exploited the cracks in the jail wall. The "to easy LL" graffiti, while written by the group, carried the spiritual fingerprint of Groves' arrogance. It was a message that said he saw through the facade of their authority. The police weren't hunting a terrified fugitive. They were hunting a man who believed he had already won the mental game, a man who looked at a double life sentence and decided to simply walk away from it. While the physical manhunt tore through the swamps and streets of Louisiana, a quieter, darker investigation was turning the lens inward, dissecting the staff and operations of the Orleans Parish Justice Center itself. The central question that haunted the administration was not how the men got out, but why the path had been so perfectly paved for them. The investigation quickly zeroed in on the maintenance issue that had silenced the water in the target cell. It defied all logic that a water shutoff in a high-security zone would happen without a redundant layer of oversight, unless that oversight had been willfully blinded. Detectives began to pull shift logs, maintenance requests, and phone records of every employee who had access to the plumbing infrastructure. The interrogation rooms at the sheriff's office became a revolving door of nervous staff members, their union's reps hovering defensively as investigators grilled them on protocols that had clearly been abandoned. The theory of the inside job solidified when they traced the timeline of the work order. It appeared too convenient. A bureaucratic Trojan horse entered into the system to justify the tampering that made the escape possible. This wasn't negligence. It was complicity. The revelation sent shockwaves through the department, eroding the already fragile trust between the ranks. Every guard looked at their partner with suspicion. Every maintenance worker felt the heat of the spotlight. The probe eventually culminated in the arrest of a maintenance worker, a development that confirmed the public's worst cynicism about New Orleans politics. The narrative that emerged was one of transactional corruption, the idea that the security of a major correctional facility could be bought for a price, or perhaps coerced through threats against family on the outside. The worker, whose identity was shielded initially but later leaked, became the face of the institutional failure. Under questioning, the layers of incompetence peeled back to reveal a systemic rot. Locks that had been reported broken for months, but never fixed, cameras that were known to be blind spots, and a culture of apathy that allowed inmates to effectively run the tiers. The escapees didn't just crawl through a wall. They crawled through a decade of budget cuts, poor training, and moral decay. This chapter of the investigation was crucial because it changed the stakes of the manhunt. It wasn't just about catching criminals anymore. It was about saving the reputation of a system that looked dangerously close to collapsing under the weight of its own corruption. The inside job angle gave the escape a flavor of conspiracy that kept it in the headlines, fueling the narrative that the Orleans 10 hadn't just beaten the jail, they had owned it. The betrayal from within stung the honest deputies the hardest, adding a personal vendetta to the search for Groves and the others. They needed to bring them back to prove that the badge still meant something, even if the building it protected was broken. By late May, the initial adrenaline of the escape had settled into a grinding, tactical war of attrition, with the task force systematically dismantling the group of 10 fugitives one by one. The picking off phase was a masterclass in modern surveillance and old-school tracking. The group had scattered like buckshot, but without resources or a long-term plan, most were simply treading water, waiting to be drowned by the inevitable. The captures were cinematic in their variety, illustrating the diverse and desperate paths the men had taken. One escapee was tracked to a budget hotel in the French Quarter, hiding in the parking garage, living off vending machines, and trying to blend in with the tourists. The takedown was swift. SWAT teams swarmed the concrete structure, cutting off exits, the blue lights reflecting off the slick oil stains of the floor. Another was found in a much more hostile environment, the swampy fringes of St. Charles Parish. U.S. Marshals, utilizing thermal drones and airboats, cornered the man in the dense, mosquito-choked marshland. He was dehydrated, covered in insect bites, and delirious from exposure, a stark contrast to the bravado of the easy graffiti. He surrendered without a fight, the swamp having beaten him long before the handcuffs clicked. As the head count of captured inmates rose 4, 5, 6, then 9, the public breathed a collective sigh of relief. But for the investigators, the victory was hollow. The math didn't add up to a win because the most significant variable was still missing. Derrick Groves remained a ghost. With every capture, the detectives interrogated the recovered inmates, offering deals and squeezing them for information on Groves' whereabouts. Where did he go? Who was he meeting? The answers were frustratingly consistent. He split. He didn't trust us. He went his own way. It became clear that Groves had viewed the other 9 not as partners, but as chaff, distractions to saturate the police resources while he made his real move. The captures of the others served to highlight Groves' sophistication. While they were getting caught in local traps, buying burner phones that could be traced, or contacting ex-girlfriends who were already under surveillance, Groves had gone completely dark. The task force began to refer to him as the Phantom. The pile of closed files on the desk grew higher, but the one empty folder labeled Groves seemed to weigh more than all the others combined. The success of catching 90% of the group only amplified the failure of missing the one man who mattered most. The hunt had transitioned from a wide net to a single, high-stakes spear fishing expedition. June arrived with the heavy, wet heat of a New Orleans summer, and with it came the dreaded silence of a cold trail. The tips that had flooded Crime Stoppers in the early days, sightings at gas stations, whispers in barbershops, nervous calls from neighbors, began to dry up. The face of Derrick Groves, once a staple of the nightly news broadcast, began to fade from the cheering, replaced by the next scandal or weather event. For the public, the fear subsided. For the task force, the silence was deafening and maddening. This is the phase of a manhunt that breaks the spirit of lesser investigators, the dead zone. The leads were exhausted. Every address in Groves' known history had been knocked on. Surveillance vans had sat for hundreds of hours outside the homes of distant cousins, and digital tripwires on social media remained untriggered. It was as if Groves had ceased to exist the moment he crossed the parish line. The investigation shifted gears from the high-octane raids of May to the slow, eye-straining work of data analysis. Analysts combed through years of phone records, looking for a sleeper contact, someone Groves hadn't spoken to in years who might be harboring him now. They looked for financial transactions, the use of a stolen identity, anything that would ripple the surface of the digital ocean. But Groves was disciplined. He wasn't making mistakes. The cold trails phase highlighted the terrifying reality of how easy it is to vanish in America if one is willing to sever all ties to their past life. The U.S. Marshals expanded their search internationally and across state lines, operating on the theory that he had left Louisiana entirely. They plastered his face on billboards in Houston, Atlanta, and Memphis, the major hubs of the I-10 and I-20 corridors. The frustration in the squad room was palpable. Maps on the wall were covered in red X's marking dead ends. The psychological toll on the officers was significant. Every day Groves remained free was a day he was laughing at them, a living embodiment of the easy taunt. They knew that statistically, the longer a fugitive is on the run, the more comfortable they get, and comfort leads to errors. They were waiting for him to relax, to make that one phone call, to visit a familiar face. But as June bled into July, and July into August, the phone didn't ring. The trail wasn't just cold, it was frozen. The city moved on, but the task force remained stuck in May 16th, haunted by the one that got away, knowing that somewhere out there, a double murderer was walking free, likely watching the same news broadcasts, counting the days of his impossible freedom. Derrick Groves' journey from the swamps of Louisiana to the urban sprawl of Atlanta was a masterpiece of the drift, the art of moving without leaving a footprint. He didn't take the interstate in a stolen car that would flag a license plate reader. He didn't board a bus that required ID. He moved through the underground currents of the South, a network of shadow economies and unspoken agreements. Reconstruction of his movements suggests he utilized jitney cabs, unlicensed taxis that operate in cash and don't ask questions, to hopscotch from town to town. He moved in short bursts, New Orleans to Slidell, Slidell to Mobile, Mobile to Montgomery. He stayed off the main grid, sleeping in cheap motels that took cash under the table or crashing in trap houses where the occupants were too concerned with their own illicit activities to worry about a fugitive face on the news. Groves became a chameleon. He shaved his head, altered his facial hair, and changed his gait. He adopted the persona of a drifter, a man down on his luck looking for day labor, blending perfectly into the background of the transient population. He knew that to be invisible, you don't hide in the dark. You hide in the crowd of the overlooked and ignored. By the time he reached Atlanta in late summer, the psychological weight of the drift was setting in. He was free, but it was a freedom defined by paranoia. Every police siren made his muscles coil. Every prolonged glance from a stranger felt like an accusation. He wasn't living. He was existing in a state of suspended animation, constantly looking over his shoulder. In Atlanta, the sprawling metropolis offered a better density for hiding than the smaller towns of Alabama. He found his way to a house on Honeysuckle Lane, likely through a connection forged in prison, a friend of a friend, a debt called in. This wasn't a sanctuary. It was a cell of a different kind. He couldn't leave the house during the day. He couldn't drive. He was entirely dependent on his harborers for food, information, and safety. The drift had ended, and the stagnation began. He was a shark that had stopped swimming, forced to sit still in a crawl space of anxiety. He watched the seasons change from the slit of a blind, knowing that the silence of the marshals wasn't a sign they had given up, but a sign they were listening harder. He had outrun the helicopters and the dogs, but he couldn't outrun the crushing pressure of time. He was a king in exile, ruling over a kingdom of dust bunnies and floorboards, waiting for the inevitable knock that he prayed would never come. By September 2025, the initial euphoria of freedom had curdled into a suffocating, claustrophobic reality for Derrick Groves. He had traded the steel bars of the Orleans Parish Justice Center for the drywall and drawn blinds of a nondescript house on Honeysuckle Lane in Atlanta, Georgia. This was his new cell, a prison of his own making, defined not by guards and schedules, but by a paralyzing, omnipresent paranoia. To the neighbors, the house was just another quiet residence in the sprawling suburban tapestry of the South. But inside, the air was thick with the tension of a bomb waiting to detonate. Groves was a ghost in the machine, a man who technically didn't exist. He couldn't drive a car, couldn't walk into a convenience store for a pack of cigarettes, and certainly couldn't risk a casual conversation on the porch. His entire world had shrunk to the square footage of the floor plan. He was entirely dependent on his harborers, a fragile network of associates who likely viewed him as both a burden and a liability. This dependency stripped him of the one thing he craved most: control. He was no longer the architect of the escape. He was a pet, fed and watered by others, his fate resting in hands that could turn on him the moment the heat from the U.S. Marshals got too intense. The psychological toll of this existence is often more damaging than incarceration itself. In prison, you know the rules. In hiding, the rules change every time a car slows down outside or a siren wails in the distance. Groves spent his days in a state of hypervigilance, pacing the floorboards, peering through the slats of the blinds at a world he could see but not touch, the bustling life of Atlanta mocking his static existence. The irony of his situation was profound. He had escaped a double life sentence only to sentence himself to solitary confinement in a stranger's home. Reports and psychological profiling suggest that during this period, Groves likely deteriorated mentally. The arrogance of the "to-easy LOL" graffiti belonged to a man who felt powerful. The man in the Atlanta house was likely frayed, sleepless, and constantly calculating the angles of an inevitable raid. He was living in the fugitive time dilation, where minutes feel like hours and every phone notification sounds like a gavel dropping. He had to be quiet, invisible, a phantom in the corner of the room. The mundane became terrifying. A knock at the door for a package delivery could trigger a fight-or-flight response. He was also undoubtedly aware that the other 9 escapees had all been caught. He was the last piece on the board, the final loose end. This knowledge likely bred a fatalism in him. He knew the U.S. Marshals weren't local cops who would lose interest. They were federal hunters with infinite patience and resources. He was waiting for the other shoe to drop, living in a suspended breath. The house on Honeysuckle Lane wasn't a sanctuary. It was a waiting room for federal prison. He had run hundreds of miles to escape a cage, only to find himself hiding under the floorboards of a different one, trapped by the very notoriety he had courted. The breakthrough that cracked the case didn't come from a high-tech satellite sweep or a dramatic undercover sting. It came, as it almost always does, from a whisper. In early October 2025, the silence that had surrounded Groves for nearly 5 months was broken by a specific, credible piece of human intelligence. A tip landed on the desk of the U.S. Marshals Service Task Force. It wasn't vague. It pointed directly to the west side of Atlanta. The nature of the tip remains protected to shield the informant. But in the world of fugitive hunting, these whispers are usually born of 3 things: greed, fear, or spite. Perhaps someone in Groves' circle got tired of the risk. Perhaps a lover felt scorned. Or perhaps the reward money finally outweighed the code of silence. Whatever the catalyst, the information was the spark the task force had been waiting for. It shifted the investigation from a passive cold case status to an active, high-velocity kill chain. The marshals didn't rush in with sirens blazing immediately. That is the mistake of amateurs. Instead, they initiated a sophisticated surveillance grid around the property on Honeysuckle Lane. Unmarked vehicles with tinted windows rotated through the neighborhood. Long-range cameras and directional microphones were likely deployed to confirm occupancy without alerting the target. They needed visual confirmation. They needed to know who else was in the house. They needed to know if Groves was armed, a virtual certainty given his history. The verification process was agonizingly slow for the agents who were itching to make the collar, but it was essential. They were hunting a cop killer, a man who had already demonstrated a conscious decision to kill. They couldn't afford a mistake. For days, the house was under a microscope. Agents analyzed the trash, the comings and goings of visitors, and the patterns of light and shadow in the windows. They were looking for the tell, a silhouette that matched Groves' build, a face in the window that shouldn't be there. Finally, the confirmation came. Maybe it was a glimpse of him moving past a window, or a voice print match from intercepted call. The whisper had become a roar. The command was given to assemble the tactical teams. This wasn't going to be a knock and talk. This was going to be a siege. The coordination involved the U.S. Marshals, local Atlanta SWAT, and K-9 units. They mapped the entry points, the fatal funnels, and the potential escape routes. The net that had been cast over the entire South had now tightened to a single zip code, then a single street, and finally, a single wooden structure. The ghost had been found. The hunters checked their weapons, put on their body armor, and prepared to bring the final member of the Orleans 10 back to the concrete reality he thought he had escaped. On the morning of October 8, 2025, the quiet neighborhood of Honeysuckle Lane was shattered by the overwhelming, militarized force of the federal government. It was a scene straight out of Hollywood blockbuster, but with the gritty, shaky cam texture of reality. Bearcats, armored tactical vehicles, rolled onto the lawn, crushing the grass, their turrets traversing toward the front door. Dozens of officers in heavy tactical gear, emblazoned with U.S. Marshal and police, swarmed the perimeter, establishing a hard seal that not even a rat could slip through. The air was filled with the amplified, robotic boom of the bullhorn. Derrick Groves. Come out with your hands up. We know you are in there. The house stood silent, a defiant wooden box against the might of the state. Groves, true to his nature, did not walk out. He wasn't going to make it easy. The standoff ensued, a tense psychological chess match played at gunpoint. Negotiators tried to make contact, But the silence from inside was the only answer. The authorities knew Groves' history. They knew he had nothing to lose, which made him the most dangerous kind of adversary. The neighborhood was evacuated, the streets taped off, the world narrowed down to the distance between the SWAT shield and the front door. When the patience of the command post was exhausted, the tactics shifted from negotiation to extraction. The sound of gas canisters being fired thumped through the air. Thwomp, thwomp, thwomp. Tear gas grenades smashed through the windows, filling the house with a choking, blinding white chemical fog. The purpose was to make the environment unlivable, to force the biological instinct to breathe, to override the criminal instinct to hide. Windows shattered. The front door was breached with a battering ram, the wood splintering inward. Tactical teams poured into the entryway, their weapon lights cutting through the haze of the gas. Police! Search warrant! Call out! The shouting was disciplined but aggressive. They cleared room by room, checking closets, under beds, behind sofas. But Groves wasn't in the living room. He wasn't in the kitchen. He wasn't in the bedrooms. For a terrifying moment, there was a fear that the intelligence was wrong, or that he had slipped into a fourth dimension. But the dogs knew better. The K-9 units were brought in, their noses cutting through the tear gas to lock onto the scent of fear and adrenaline. The dog didn't pull toward the back door. It pulled down. It pulled toward the floor. The hunt wasn't horizontal anymore. It was vertical. Groves had gone aground, quite literally. The endgame of the 5-month manhunt played out in the claustrophobic dirt and darkness of a crawl space beneath the house. It was a poetic, almost literary conclusion to the saga. The man who had escaped through a hole in the wall was now cornered in a hole in the ground. The K-9 unit barked furiously at a panel in the floor, signaling the final hiding spot. Officers ripped away the access cover, shining their lights into the abyss. There, squeezed into the dirt, surrounded by cobwebs and the foundation of the house, was Derrick Groves. He wasn't the swaggering inmate who wrote to Easy LOL. He was a cornered animal, coughing from the gas, covered in dust, his eyes wide with the realization that the road had finally run out. The officers shouted commands, their weapons trained on the darkness. "Show me your hands. Crawl out. Now." The tension was razor thin. A sudden movement could have ended in a fusillade of gunfire. But Groves, perhaps realizing the sheer futility of fighting a SWAT team from a prone position in the dirt, finally complied. He was dragged out of the crawl space, his body limp with defeat. The physical contact of the handcuffs clicking around his wrists signaled the official end of the Orleans 10 saga. He was hauled to his feet, dusted off not out of kindness, but to verify his identity. The agents looked him in the face that had haunted their briefings for 145 days. It was him. The relief among the task force was explosive. High fives and handshakes were exchanged as Groves was marched out of the house, past the shattered windows and the chemical fog, and into the bright Atlanta sunlight. The media cameras, kept at a distance, captured the perp walk. Groves looked smaller than his legend, a man reduced to a prisoner once again. He was placed in the back of a secure vehicle, the heavy door slamming shut with a finality that echoed all the way back to New Orleans. There were no LOL graffiti tags here. There was no clever escape route. There was just the back seat of a federal transport and the long, silent ride back to face the music. The T-Easy crew was officially extinct. The capture was clean, surgical, and absolute. Derrick Groves was back in the box, and this time, the welds would be double-checked. On December 12th, 2025, just 3 days before this narrative is being told, the final act of the tragedy played out in a sterile courtroom in New Orleans. Derrick Groves stood before Judge Dennis Waldron, no longer a fugitive, but a defendant stripped of all power. The courtroom was packed, families of the victims of his 2018 murders, law enforcement officers who had spent months hunting him, and a media that had turned his escape into a spectacle. The atmosphere was heavy with judgment. Groves, wearing the shackles he had briefly outrun, listened as the weight of the law was brought down upon him. Judge Waldron did not mince words. In a blistering sentencing statement, he deconstructed Groves' character, citing his conscious decision to kill during the 2018 Mardi Gras murders. The judge stripped away any romanticism about the escape, framing it not as a clever feat, but as an extension of Groves' total disregard for societal rules. The escape wasn't a lark. It was an insult to the victims' families, a delay of the justice they were owed. The sentence was delivered with the force of a hammer. 2 life sentences plus 100 years. It was a symbolic number, a mathematical guarantee that Derrick Groves would die in prison. The plus 100 years was the judiciary's way of ensuring that no parole board, no appeal, and no future legal loophole would ever see him walk free. He was being buried under years. As the sentence was read, the ghost of the "to easy LOL" graffiti seemed to dissolve completely. The escape, the manhunt, the viral fame, it all amounted to nothing but a stricter cage and a longer sentence. Groves was led away, back to the Louisiana State Penitentiary at Angola, a place far harder and less forgiving than the parish jail he had fled. The story of the Orleans 10 ends not with a bang, but with the cold, hard click of a lock. It serves as a grim reminder that while breaking out might be easy due to crumbling infrastructure, staying out is an impossible game against a system that has infinite memory and infinite time. Derrick Groves had his 145 days of freedom, but he paid for them with his life. The laughter on the wall had faded. The silence of the cell was now eternal. Was 145 days of looking over your shoulder worth a century in a cage? You tell me. If you want the full breakdown of the inside job theory, hit that subscribe button right now. You do not want to miss next week's episode on the maintenance man who turned off the water. Stay safe and check your locks.